The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's legendary training grounds as 23 recruits stood at rigid attention, their boots polished to mirror-shine, uniforms crisp against the Carolina dawn. They had survived a brutal selection process to reach this moment, the first day of the Advanced Tactical Specialized course. Only the finest made it this far. Among them stood Morgan Reed, a petite 5'2" woman with chestnut hair, pulled back in regulation style, and piercing blue eyes that remained fixed straight ahead. At 20 years old, she was the smallest recruit by far, her frame almost childlike next to the towering men surrounding her. Yet there was something in her posture, a stillness, a control, that made Drill Sergeant James Ramirez pause when he reached her during his inspection. Ramirez, a weathered 58-year-old veteran with 3 decades of Special Forces operations etched into the lines of his face, studied her with narrowed eyes. He'd seen every type of recruit pass through these gates. Farm boys with shoulders like oxen, college athletes, street fighters. But something about this one caught his attention. She didn't fidget under his gaze, didn't swallow nervously, barely seemed to breathe. West Point graduate, he noted aloud, reading from her file. Top of your class in marksmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and tactical theory. His voice carried the gravel of too many nights and too many deserts across too many wars. Impressive on paper, Reed. We'll see if it translates to the real world. Morgan didn't react beyond a crisp, "Yes, Sergeant." Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the morning air with perfect control. 50 yards away, Colonel William Thompson observed from the shade of the administration building. At 62, the old Cold War warrior had seen the best America could produce. His steel gray hair and ramrod-straight posture were relics of another era, a time of shadows and secrets when men like him had stood as silent sentinels against the Soviet threat. Now he watched this new generation with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Group assignments, Ramirez barked, consulting his clipboard. The recruits shifted imperceptibly, the tension in their bodies betraying the importance of this moment. Team dynamics could make or break a soldier's future in special operations. Alpha Team, Ramirez called out. Miller Jason, a broad-shouldered giant of a man, stepped forward. 6'3", 230 pounds of Texas swagger. His close-cropped blonde hair and square jaw completed the picture of the perfect soldier. Cooper Ryan, a compact, muscular recruit with quick eyes and the coiled energy of a boxer, joined the line. Prescott Michael, a serious-faced man with the bearing of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since birth, the 3rd generation of his family to serve. Diaz Carlos, a wiry recruit with intelligent eyes and an easy confidence, stepped up, the hint of a smile playing at his lips, despite the formality of the moment. Hayes Brandon, a lean, quiet man with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd already seen combat, joined the line. His fingers, a sniper's fingers, were perfectly still at his sides. Reed Morgan. She moved forward with an efficient grace, taking her place beside men who towered over her. Jason Miller's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with unconcealed disdain. A woman, a tiny woman at that, in his elite training course. Great, he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. They're letting children in now. Ryan Cooper, the former boxer, suppressed a smile while Michael Prescott maintained his professional demeanor. Carlos Diaz shot Miller a warning glance, but Brandon Hayes simply observed his sniper's eyes, missing nothing about the new addition to their team. Alpha Team will report to Barracks 3. Ramirez continued, ignoring the undercurrent. You have 30 minutes to stow your gear before combat training begins. As they marched toward the barracks, Miller deliberately brushed past Morgan, forcing her to adjust her stride. Hope you can keep up, little girl, he said without looking at her. This isn't West Point anymore. Morgan's eyes flickered to his face for a brief moment, then away. She said nothing. The barracks were Spartan, 6 bunks, 6-foot lockers, nothing more. The men claimed their spaces, quickly leaving Morgan with the bunk nearest the door. As they unpacked, the silence was heavy with unasked questions. Carlos Diaz, ever the communicator, was the first to extend an olive branch. West Point, must have been tough. Morgan looked up from meticulously arranging her gear. It was educational, she replied, her voice revealing nothing. Where are you from, Reed? Michael Prescott asked, his curiosity professional rather than friendly. Northern California. Her answers were precise, minimal, offering no foothold for further conversation. Jason Miller snorted. California, figures. Brandon Hayes, who had been silently arranging his sniper's toolkit, spoke up unexpectedly. USMC Scout Sniper School has a saying, judge by results, not appearances. His quiet words carried a weight that momentarily silenced Miller. The tension was broken by Ramirez's voice echoing through the barracks. Combat training, 5 minutes. Field 3. And the sun had climbed higher as Alpha Team assembled on the training mat. The air smelled of sweat and determination, mixed with the faint scent of cleaning supplies from the night before. Ramirez stood at the center, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the recruits. Hand-to-hand combat is the foundation of everything you'll learn here, he announced, pacing before them. When your weapon jams, when you're out of ammunition, when everything goes wrong, you'll have nothing but your hands and your will to survive. The male recruits exchanged confident glances. This was familiar territory, the ultimate test of strength and masculinity. Jason Miller flexed his considerable biceps unconsciously. We'll start with defensive positions, Ramirez continued. Reed stepped forward. A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Morgan moved to the center of the mat with smooth, controlled steps, her face betraying nothing. When someone attacks you, your first priority is protection, Ramirez explained, demonstrating proper stance and guard positions. Keep your hands up, protect your head and torso, maintain balance. He positioned himself in front of Morgan, demonstrating several defensive postures, using her as his training partner. Miller watched with barely concealed amusement, whispering to Cooper, "This is going to be painful to watch." "Pair up for practice," Ramirez ordered. "Miller, you're with Reed." A predatory smile spread across Miller's face as he stepped onto the mat opposite Morgan. At 6'1" and 210 pounds, he dwarfed her completely. "Don't worry," he said condescendingly. "I'll go easy on you." Morgan said nothing, simply taking her position across from him, her stance perfect, her breathing unchanged. "The drill is simple," Ramirez explained. "One person attacks slowly and controlled. The other practices defensive movements. Switch roles every 2 minutes. He paused, then added, "Miller, you attack first." Miller launched a telegraphed punch toward Morgan's shoulder, expecting her to stumble backward or throw up her arms in panic. Instead, she moved. It was like watching water flow around a rock. One moment she was directly in the path of his fist, the next she had shifted 6 inches to the side, just enough for his punch to graze harmlessly past her. Her deflection of his arm was so subtle that Miller almost didn't feel it until he was already off balance. Frowning, he tried again with more force, aiming a hook toward her ribs. This time, Morgan ducked under his swing, with fluid grace simultaneously stepping to his blind spot. Miller turned, frustration building, to find her perfectly balanced behind him. "What the hell?" he muttered, the training exercise forgotten, as he launched a rapid combination of punches. Morgan's movements accelerated to match his aggression. Each attack seemed to meet empty air as she slipped away from contact with minimal movement, her hands redirecting his force with techniques that seemed familiar, yet impossible to counter. Around them, the other pairs had stopped their own drills to watch the unusual spectacle. Miller, the alpha male, the natural athlete, the fighter, couldn't lay a finger on the smallest recruit in the course. "Time," Ramirez called. "Switch roles." Miller was breathing heavily, more from frustration than exertion. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he shifted to a defensive stance, confidence giving way to uncertainty. "Slow and controlled," Ramirez reminded them. "This is about technique, not power." Morgan nodded once, then moved forward. Her first strike was a simple palm thrust toward Miller's chest, delivered with perfect form. Miller moved to block it with his forearm, expecting little impact from someone her size. The strike hit his forearm with surprising precision, sending a numbing sensation shooting up to his elbow. His arm tingled oddly, as if she had somehow found a nerve center that bypassed his muscular advantage. "The hell was that?" he said, shaking his arm. Morgan reset her position and moved forward again, this time with a combination of strikes that flowed together like a choreographed dance. Each movement was precise and economical, with no wasted motion or excessive force. Miller tried to defend himself, but found that every time he moved to block one strike, Morgan was already targeting a different opening. Her hands seemed to find gaps in his defense that he didn't know existed, striking pressure points that sent confusion signals to his muscles. It wasn't painful, it was something worse. It was systematic dismantling of his defenses by someone who seemed to know his body's weaknesses better than he did. "Enough," Miller said, stepping back and holding up his hands. "This isn't working." "The drill isn't over, recruit," Ramirez said firmly. "Get back in position." Reluctantly, Miller resumed his stance. This time, Morgan moved even more fluidly, her strikes becoming a flowing sequence that seemed to come from all angles at once. Miller found himself completely overwhelmed, unable to track the speed and precision of her movements. Within 30 seconds, he was stumbling backward, his arms aching from failed blocks. his balance compromised by subtle foot sweeps he hadn't even seen coming. A final palm strike to his sternum, delivered with control that spoke of immense restraint, sent him sprawling onto his back. The training facility fell silent. Every recruit stared in disbelief at the scene before them. Jason Miller, the physical specimen, the natural leader, flat on his back, put there by a woman half his size. "What the actual fuck?" Miller gasped, struggling to his feet with wounded pride burning in his eyes. "Language, recruit," Ramirez warned, though his own eyes never left Morgan. They were narrowed now, studying her with new interest. "Cooper, you're up with Reed." One by one, each member of Alpha Team faced Morgan on the mat. Ryan Cooper's boxing experience proved useless against an opponent who never seemed to be where his punches landed. Michael Prescott's textbook military hand-to-hand techniques were countered before he could complete them. Carlos Diaz's quick reflexes earned him the longest exchange, but eventually he too found himself outmaneuvered. Brandon Hayes, the quiet observer, lasted the longest, his analytical mind adapting to her patterns. But even he was systematically taken apart by techniques he couldn't identify. By the end of the training session, all 5 male recruits stood along the edge of the mat, a mixture of confusion and newfound respect on their faces. They had entered the facility confident in their physical abilities and certain they would need to protect their smallest team member. Instead, they had discovered that Morgan Reed was unlike anyone they had ever encountered. Ramirez dismissed the group with instructions to report for physical conditioning after lunch. As they filed out, he caught Morgan by the shoulder. "Where did you learn to fight like that, Reed?" he asked quietly, his voice too low for the others to hear. Morgan met his gaze with calm blue eyes. "My grandfather taught me, Sergeant." "Your grandfather must be quite the instructor," Ramirez replied, studying her face for any reaction. "He was thorough," she said simply, then turned to follow her teammates. Ramirez watched her go, then glanced toward the administration building, where Colonel Thompson stood observing. The 2 old soldiers exchanged a look heavy with unspoken questions. The mess hall buzzed with conversation as Alpha Team sat together at a corner table. The story of the morning's combat training had spread through the base like wildfire, and curious glances were directed toward their table, particularly at the small woman eating methodically at the end. "So," Carlos ventured, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "that was impressive, Reed." Morgan looked up from her meal briefly, then continued eating without response. "Where exactly in Northern California are you from?" Michael pressed his natural curiosity, overwhelming his military formality. "Sierra Foothills," she replied between bites, offering nothing more. Jason Miller, his ego still bruised, leaned forward. "Look, we're going to be a team. That means communication. That means trust. That means knowing who we're working with." His voice carried an edge of challenge. "So how about you start sharing something real?" Morgan set down her fork and regarded him directly for the first time. Her blue eyes were unnervingly calm, holding his gaze with neither aggression nor submission. "My grandfather raised me on a remote property in the mountains," she said evenly. "He taught me to hunt, to track, to fight. I enlisted because he said I could serve with distinction. Is that real enough for you, Miller?" The directness of her response momentarily silenced him. Brandon Hayes, who had been quietly observing as always, spoke up. "What you did this morning wasn't standard military hand-to-hand," he said. "I recognized elements of Krav Maga, but there were other techniques I've never seen before." A ghost of a smile touched Morgan's lips. "My grandfather believed in comprehensive education." "Was he military?" Ryan asked, genuinely curious now. "Yes," Morgan answered, then returned to her meal. "Which branch?" Michael followed up. "Several," she replied cryptically. The men exchanged glances. Carlos laughed softly, breaking the tension. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Morgan didn't answer, but something in her posture softened slightly. "Doesn't matter," Jason said abruptly. "Fancy moves in a controlled environment don't mean much in the field. This afternoon will be different." The obstacle course, known as the Devil's Mile, stretched before Alpha Team under the punishing afternoon sun. A legendary test of physical endurance and mental fortitude, it featured walls to scale tunnels, to crawl through rope climbs, balance beams suspended over mud pits, and a final sprint through waist-deep water. Ramirez stood before them, clipboard in hand. "Individual runs first, then you'll tackle it as a team. Your combined time will determine your standing against the other training groups." He consulted his list. "Miller, you're up first." Jason approached the starting line with grim determination. Whatever had happened that morning, this was his territory. Raw physical power and endurance. He attacked the course with aggression, muscling his way through obstacles, leaving nothing in reserve. When he crossed the finish line, his time was impressive. He bent over, hands on knees, breathing heavily but satisfied. One by one, the others completed the course. Cooper used his agility to good effect. Prescott's methodical approach served him well. Diaz surprised everyone with his speed. Hayes moved with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. Reed, Ramirez called, "You're up." Morgan approached the starting line seemingly unaffected by the heat or the intimidating course before her. The men of Alpha Team watched with curiosity, some hoping for redemption, others simply wondering what new surprises she might reveal. At Ramirez's whistle, she began moving. What happened next defied their expectations once again. Morgan didn't simply run the course. She flowed through it like water, finding the path of least resistance. Where the men had powered through obstacles with strength and determination, she used momentum and precise technique. Her movements had an economy that was mesmerizing to watch, as if she had calculated the minimum energy expenditure required for each challenge. She scaled walls using tiny handholds the others hadn't noticed. She navigated the balance beams, not with cautious steps, but with confident strides. She swung through the rope section with a gymnast's precision. Most surprisingly, she crawled through the mud tunnel using an unusual inverted technique that kept her face clean and allowed for faster movement. When Morgan crossed the finish line, Ramirez checked his stopwatch twice. She had beaten the previous best time by nearly 40 seconds and showed hardly any signs of exertion. Her breathing controlled her uniform, only minimally soiled. "How the hell did you do that?" Ryan asked, unable to hide his amazement. "Efficiency," Morgan replied, simply wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. Ramirez made a note on his clipboard, his face expressionless. "Now for the team exercise. You'll run the course together, helping each other through. The goal is for all 6 of you to finish. Your time stops when the last team member crosses the line." As they gathered at the starting point, an awkward silence fell over Alpha Team. That morning, they had been a group of individuals. Now, after witnessing Morgan's abilities, the power dynamics had shifted, leaving uncertainty in their wake. To everyone's surprise, it was Morgan who broke the silence. "Miller," she said quietly, "your upper body strength will be crucial for the wall section. If you boost the others, we can save time." Jason looked at her suspiciously but nodded. "Cooper, your agility makes you perfect for the balance beams. You should go first there and help steady the others." Ryan raised an eyebrow but didn't object. "Prescott, take point on the navigation decisions. You have the best tactical mind." Michael straightened slightly at the recognition. "Diaz, keep our morale up and maintain communication throughout." Carlos grinned. "That I can do." "Hayes, you have the best endurance. You should anchor the team and make sure no one falls behind." Brandon nodded once, acknowledging the assessment. "And what about you?" Jason asked, a challenge in his voice. Morgan looked at each of them in turn. "I'll help wherever needed." The whistle blew and Alpha Team launched into the course. What followed was a revelation. Morgan, who had demonstrated such exceptional individual ability, proved even more valuable as a teammate. She seemed to intuitively understand each person's strengths and limitations, appearing at precisely the right moment to provide assistance. When Jason hesitated at a particularly challenging wall climb, Morgan was there with a suggestion for an alternative handhold. When Ryan lost his balance on a narrow beam, she steadied him without making him feel incompetent. She guided Michael through a decision point, supported Carlos when his energy flagged, and worked seamlessly with Brandon to ensure the team maintained cohesion. Most remarkably, she accomplished all of this while making it seem as though her teammates were succeeding through their own abilities rather than her assistance. By the time they crossed the finish line together, something had changed in Alpha Team's dynamic. They had experienced not just Morgan's physical capabilities, but her leadership instincts as well. "Second best team time of the year," Ramirez announced, checking his stopwatch. The team members exchanged glances of genuine pride, a shared accomplishment that felt well earned despite, or perhaps because of the morning's revelations. As they walked back toward the barracks for evening cleanup, Jason found himself walking beside Morgan. The antagonism from earlier had been replaced by a reluctant curiosity. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made assumptions that were completely wrong." Morgan glanced at him but didn't immediately respond. "I've always judged people by what I can see," Jason continued. "Size, attitude, how they carry themselves. I thought I had you figured out the moment you walked in." "Most people do," Morgan replied simply. "Is that why you don't talk much? Because people make assumptions anyway?" Morgan was silent for several steps before answering. "Talking doesn't change what people see. Actions do." Jason nodded thoughtfully. Where did you really learn to fight like that? And don't give me that vague answer about your grandfather. After today, I think we deserve to know who we're really training with. Morgan stopped walking, causing the rest of the group to pause as well. For a moment, it seemed she might finally open up about her background. The other recruits gathered around, clearly hoping for real answers. My grandfather was military, Morgan said finally. He taught me that strength comes in many forms, and the most dangerous opponents are often the ones you underestimate. What branch? Michael asked immediately. Army, Marines? Different ones, Morgan replied, falling back into her pattern of minimal responses. Carlos laughed, but it was friendly rather than mocking. You're never going to give us a straight answer, are you? I've given you straight answers, Morgan said. You just want different answers than the ones I'm giving. Ryan shook his head in amazement. You're like a puzzle wrapped in a riddle. Every time we think we understand you, you show us something new. As they entered the barracks, other recruits openly stared at Alpha Team, particularly at Morgan. Word of her performances had spread throughout the base, and she had become the subject of intense speculation. Is it true she took down Miller without breaking a sweat? One recruit whispered. I heard she ran the Devil's Mile faster than anyone in the last 3 years, another added. Morgan seemed completely unbothered by the attention. She collected her shower kit and headed toward the women's facilities, leaving her teammates to ponder the enigma that had been dropped into their midst. That evening, as lights out approached, the members of Alpha Team lay in their bunks replaying the day's events in their minds. The silence was broken by Brandon's quiet voice. Those techniques you used today, he said, staring at the ceiling. I saw something similar once in Afghanistan. There was a spec ops team that came through our forward operating base. Never said which unit they were with. They moved differently, fought differently. Morgan didn't respond, but in the dim light, they could see she was listening. My spotter said they were ghosts, Brandon continued. People who officially didn't exist running missions that never happened. He turned his head slightly to look at Morgan's bunk. Your grandfather wasn't just regular military, was he? In the silence that followed, the question hung in the air unanswered, but not denied. Finally, Morgan spoke. He taught me that real strength isn't about proving you're better than other people, she said softly. It's about making the people around you better than they thought they could be. Is that why you helped us through the obstacle course? Ryan realized. You could have just blazed through it yourself and made us all look bad. What would be the point of that? Morgan asked, genuine puzzlement in her voice. We succeed or fail as a team. Making you look bad would just make the whole team weaker. A new silence fell over Alpha Team. A thoughtful one. Each member was reassessing their initial impressions of the quiet, deadly efficient woman in their midst. Before anyone could speak again, the lights went out, signaling mandatory rest period. In the darkness, Colonel Thompson stood outside the barracks, deep in conversation with Ramirez. Both men spoke in hushed tones, their faces grave in the moonlight. You're certain about what you saw? Thompson asked. Ramirez nodded. Ghost program techniques. Hasn't been taught in 20 years. Not since the end of the Cold War. He paused. There's something else. The way she moves, it's familiar somehow. How so? Reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago, a man named Sullivan. Thompson's head snapped up. Alexander Sullivan. You knew him. The old colonel's face darkened with memory. We ran operations together. Eastern Europe 82 through 85. He looked toward the darkened barracks. If there's a connection there. What do we do? Ramirez asked. Thompson was silent for a long moment. We watch. We wait. His eyes narrowed with the calculation of a man who had spent decades in shadows. And we find out exactly who Morgan Reed really is. Inside the barracks, in the darkness of her bunk, Morgan Reed lay awake. Her breathing controlled, her mind clear. She had revealed more today than intended, not in words, but in action. Her grandfather had warned her this might happen. One day, he had told her during those long training sessions in the mountains, your abilities will force you to make a choice between hiding who you are and becoming who you're meant to be. As sleep finally claimed her, Morgan wondered if that day had already arrived. 2 weeks passed at Fort Bragg like a storm front, intense, unrelenting, transforming everything in its path. Alpha Team had evolved from 6 individuals into a cohesive unit that consistently outperformed every other group in the Advanced Tactical Specialized course. Their success had become the talk of the base, whispered about in mess halls and barracks with equal parts admiration and envy. Dawn broke crisp and clear as Alpha Team assembled for morning physical training. The routine had become familiar. 5 miles of running through North Carolina pine forests, followed by strength conditioning, that pushed even the fittest recruits to their limits. Jason Miller, once the undisputed alpha male, now paced himself alongside Morgan Reed, their strides matching despite the dramatic difference in their heights. "You're still not telling us everything," Jason said between controlled breaths as they led the formation along the forest trail. Sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the morning chill. "2 weeks and you're still a mystery." Morgan's breathing remained perfectly steady, her form efficient and economical. "Does it matter? We work well together now." Jason considered this as they rounded a bend in the trail. Behind them, the rest of Alpha Team maintained formation. Ryan Cooper with his boxer's footwork, Michael Prescott with military precision, Carlos Diaz somehow managing to look relaxed even at this pace, and Brandon Hayes bringing up the rear with vigilant eyes. "It matters when your teammates know you can snap a man's neck 6 different ways, but don't know where you learned it," Jason replied. A ghost of a smile touched Morgan's lips. "Only 4 ways, actually. The other 2 were improvised." It was the kind of dry humor that had slowly begun to emerge as she grew more comfortable with the team. Small revelations like water gradually wearing down stone. That evening, as Alpha Team gathered in their barracks after dinner, the usual post-training analysis gave way to something more personal. Carlos, ever the one to break barriers, had smuggled in a package of cookies sent by his mother. Contraband that would earn them all extra PT if discovered, but worth the risk for a taste of normalcy. "My abuela always said food loosens tongues," Carlos said, distributing his treasure among the team. "So how about it read fair trade, cookies for stories?" Morgan accepted the offering with surprising grace. She hesitated, then spoke in a voice that for once wasn't measured and controlled. "I grew up in a cabin in the northern Sierra Nevada mountains," she began. "No electricity, running water from a stream. Nearest neighbor was 5 miles away." She took a small bite of cookie, her eyes distant with memory. "My grandfather, I only ever called him grandfather, raised me after my mother died when I was 5. I never knew my father." The men listened, suddenly aware they were hearing something precious, truth freely given rather than grudgingly extracted. "Grandfather started training me when I turned 6, Morgan continued. "Every morning began with a 5-mile run regardless of weather. Snow, rain, it didn't matter. Then combat training before breakfast, marksmanship after lunch, tactics and strategy lessons in the evening." "That's not a childhood," Ryan said softly. "That's a military program." Morgan met his eyes. "He always said he was preparing me for a world that wouldn't forgive weakness." "Was he military?" Michael asked, his family's generations of service giving the question weight. Morgan nodded, among other things. "What kind of man trains a 6-year-old girl like a Special Forces operator?" Jason asked the question that had been bothering all of them. Morgan looked down at the cookie in her hand, then back up. For the first time, real emotion flickered across her face, something between pride and sadness. "A thorough one," she answered, echoing her earlier description to Ramirez. "He was harsh but never cruel, demanding but never unfair. He taught me that true strength comes from discipline and control, not aggression." She paused, then added, "He would wake me at random times during the night, sometimes with a hand over my mouth, sometimes with a flashlight in my eyes. Adaptability, he called it. Learning to wake instantly alert, ready to fight or flee." "Jesus," Carlos whispered. Brandon, who had been characteristically quiet, spoke up. "SEER training techniques. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. They teach that to special forces, not children." Morgan shrugged slightly. He believed in being thorough. The conversation might have continued, but the barracks door swung open. Sergeant Ramirez stepped in, his weathered face unreadable. "Alpha Team," he announced. "Report to Tactical Operations Center at 0600 tomorrow. Special assignment." After he left, excitement rippled through the group. Special assignments were rare during training, typically reserved for the final phase, not the middle of the course. "What do you think it is?" Ryan asked, unable to contain his enthusiasm. "Has to be a field exercise," Michael replied, his military background surfacing. "Probably a multi-day operation." "Whatever it is," Jason said, his eyes finding Morgan's, "it's a test." Morgan nodded, once her expression returning to its usual calm. But there was something else there now. A readiness and anticipation that hadn't been present before. Whatever was coming, she had been waiting for it. The Tactical Operations Center hummed with activity despite the early hour. Alpha Team stood at attention as Colonel Thompson himself briefed them, a rarity that underscored the importance of the mission. "Hostage rescue simulation," Thompson explained, his voice carrying the gravity of decades of command. 6 civilians held in a building complex 2 miles from here. Your mission is to infiltrate, neutralize the hostiles, and extract the civilians without casualties. He gestured to a detailed tactical map displayed on the wall screen. The complex consisted of 3 connected buildings arranged in a defensive triangle surrounded by open terrain with minimal cover. The opposition force consists of 6 Marine Corps veterans who volunteer for these exercises. Thompson continued, they know the terrain, they know the building layout, and they know how to fight. They're equipped with superior weapons and defensive positions. Jason glanced at his teammates. 6 against 6 seemed fair until you factored in the defenders' advantages. This exercise typically results in mission failure for recruit teams, Thompson added, confirming Jason's concerns. The point isn't necessarily to succeed, but to see how you perform under extreme pressure and how well you function as a unit when everything goes wrong. Have any recruit teams ever completed this successfully? Michael asked. 2 teams in the past 5 years, Thompson replied. Both of those teams included recruits with prior military experience or extensive combat training backgrounds. His eyes lingered briefly on Morgan, so briefly that most might have missed it. But she noticed, and so did Brandon, whose sniper's attention to detail missed nothing. You have 30 minutes to plan your approach, Thompson concluded. Then you move out to the target area. Questions? When no one raised a hand, Thompson and Ramirez left the room, leaving Alpha Team alone with the tactical challenge. Okay, Jason said, taking charge as he usually did during tactical discussions. 6 Marines in defensive positions with superior firepower. This could be a disaster. Not necessarily, Morgan said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her with surprise. She rarely offered strategic input during planning sessions, usually content to follow the team's decisions. What do you mean? Michael asked. Morgan moved to the map and studied it carefully. They have advantages, but they also have weaknesses. They're expecting us to approach like typical recruits, a direct assault or a poorly coordinated attempt at stealth. What else would we do? Ryan asked. Morgan's finger traced several paths on the map. They're positioned to defend against conventional attacks. But what if we don't attack conventionally? I'm not following, Carlos said. Morgan looked at each of her teammates in turn. Jason, you're the strongest. Ryan, you're the fastest. Michael, you have the best tactical knowledge. Carlos, you're the best at improvising under pressure. Brandon, you have the steadiest hands and best shooting accuracy. What about you? Brandon asked. Morgan paused before answering. I'm good at getting into places I'm not supposed to be. Over the next 20 minutes, Morgan outlined a plan that was unlike anything her teammates had ever heard. Instead of trying to overcome the Marines' advantages, she proposed using misdirection and unconventional tactics to turn those advantages into weaknesses. This is either brilliant or completely insane, Michael said when she finished explaining. Maybe both, Jason agreed, but it's better than anything else I can come up with. The key is timing, Morgan emphasized. Everyone has to be in position exactly when we discussed, or the whole thing falls apart. As they prepared to move out, Ryan voiced what everyone was thinking. How do you know so much about tactical planning? This isn't basic military strategy. This is advanced special operations stuff. Morgan checked her equipment one final time before answering. My grandfather taught me chess when I was young. He always said the best way to win was to make your opponent think they knew what game you were playing. The team moved out into the morning mist, each member carrying their assigned equipment and knowing their specific role in Morgan's complex plan. None of them fully understood how all the pieces would fit together, but they had learned to trust their quiet teammates' judgment. Alpha Team reached their observation point 200 meters from the target using a stand of pine trees for cover. Through their field glasses, they could see the Marines had indeed positioned themselves perfectly to cover all obvious approach routes. Floodlights illuminated the open areas between buildings, and guard positions commanded excellent fields of fire. In whispered tones, Morgan began the final briefing that would determine whether her unconventional plan could actually work. Remember, they're expecting us to try sneaking up or charging in like typical recruits, she said quietly. Instead, we're going to make them come to us. Jason checked his watch. Phase 1 starts in 2 minutes. Correct, Morgan confirmed. Ryan and Carlos, you move to the eastern approach and make noise. Don't try to be stealthy. Let them see you coming. Draw their attention and return fire. That sounds like a good way to get shot full of paint, Ryan said nervously. Trust the plan, Morgan said firmly. They'll focus on the obvious threat, which creates opportunities elsewhere. Michael and Jason received their instructions next. You two circle around to the western side. When the Marines reposition to deal with Ryan and Carlos, you'll have a clear shot at the building holding the hostages. "What about you and Brandon?" Michael asked. Morgan's expression became more serious. "We're going to eliminate the guard positions." "How?" Brandon asked. "There are 4 Marines in defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. Even if Ryan and Carlos distract some of them, we can't take out 4 trained Marines." Morgan looked at her teammate and made a decision that would forever change how her team saw her. "Brandon, I need you to trust me completely for the next 15 minutes. Can you do that?" Something in her tone made Brandon nod without hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" "Follow my lead and don't question anything you see, no matter how strange it seems." As 0 hour approached, Morgan felt a familiar calm settle over her. Her grandfather's training years of practice and instincts honed through experiences her teammates could never imagine, all combining into a state of focused readiness. "Execute," she whispered into her radio. Ryan and Carlos moved toward the eastern approach exactly as planned, making enough noise to alert the defenders while still appearing to attempt stealth. Within moments, 2 of the Marine guards had repositioned to deal with the perceived threat. "Contact east," one of the Marines called out, and Morgan could hear the shift in their defensive posture through the darkness. "Phase 2, go," Morgan commanded. Michael and Jason began their approach to the hostage building while the Marines were distracted. Their movement was clean and professional, but Morgan knew it wouldn't be enough. The remaining Marines were too well positioned and too experienced to be completely fooled by the diversion. "Brandon, stay exactly 10 feet behind me and match my movements," Morgan instructed. "No matter what happens, don't break cover until I signal." They began moving toward the guard positions through terrain that offered minimal concealment. Brandon expected them to be spotted immediately, but somehow Morgan found paths through the darkness that kept them hidden from multiple sets of trained eyes. Her movement was unlike anything Brandon had ever seen. Morgan seemed to flow around obstacles and through shadows like she was part of the landscape itself. She anticipated the guards' sightlines and patrol patterns with impossible accuracy, leading Brandon through what should have been certain detection without ever being noticed. As they reached the first guard position, Brandon watched in amazement as Morgan approached a Marine who was scanning the area with professional alertness. The guard was positioned perfectly to see anyone coming, his weapon ready and his attention focused. Morgan moved behind him like a ghost. Her approach was so silent and so smooth that the Marine never sensed her presence until her training weapon was pressed against his neck. "Eliminated," she whispered, and the Marine's equipment registered the simulated kill. "What the hell?" the Marine muttered in disbelief as he realized he had been taken out without ever knowing his opponent was there. They moved to the second position, where another Marine was covering the western approach. This guard was even more alert, having heard the elimination of his teammate over the radio. "Thompson's down," he reported. "Unknown contact in Sector 7. Morgan signaled for Brandon to remain in position while she approached the second Marine. This time, Brandon had a clear view of her technique, and what he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about combat. Morgan didn't just move quietly. She seemed to anticipate the guard's every movement and reaction. When he turned left, she was already moving right. When he looked up, she was low. When he spun around at a sound, she was somehow behind him again. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but to Brandon, it seemed like watching a masterclass in combat arts. Morgan neutralized the second Marine with techniques that appeared effortless, but required skills far beyond anything taught in basic training. "2 guards down," Morgan reported quietly into her radio, moving to final positions. The third and fourth Marines had realized they were dealing with something unexpected. Instead of panicking, they had taken defensive positions and were communicating efficiently about the threat. "This isn't some recruit making lucky shots," one of them said over the radio. "Someone knows what they're doing." Morgan paused at the edge of cover, studying the positions of the remaining guards. They had arranged themselves to provide mutual support, making it impossible to approach either one without being seen by the other. "Brandon," she whispered, "I need you to provide a distraction. Move to that position and make yourself visible for exactly 3 seconds, then get back under cover." "That'll draw fire from both of them," Brandon protested. "Exactly," Morgan confirmed. 3 seconds starting now." Brandon moved into position and deliberately exposed himself to the guard's sightlines. Immediately, both Marines shifted their attention and weapons toward him, exactly as Morgan had predicted. In the 3 seconds that Brandon provided distraction, Morgan moved across 30 feet of open ground and eliminated both remaining Marines in a sequence of movements that defied conventional tactical doctrine. When Brandon emerged from cover, he found Morgan standing calmly next to 2 very confused Marines who were staring at their equipment in disbelief. "Hostage building is clear," Michael reported over the radio. All civilians extracted successfully. 0 casualties. Colonel Thompson's voice came over the radio with obvious amazement. Exercise complete. All teams returned to base for debrief. As they regrouped for the walk back, the Marines who had served as opposition force approached Alpha Team with expressions of professional respect and curiosity. That was the cleanest tactical operation I've seen in 15 years, the team leader told Morgan directly. Where did you learn to move like that? Morgan's teammates gathered around equally eager for answers. The mission success had been impressive, but the manner of their victory had been nothing short of extraordinary. My grandfather taught me that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure your opponents never realize they're in one until it's over, Morgan replied. Jason shook his head in wonder. That wasn't just good tactics. That was like watching someone who's been doing this professionally for years. Some lessons stick better than others, Morgan said simply. As they walked back to base, Brandon fell into step beside Morgan. That was incredible, but it also raises questions I'm not sure I want answers to. Morgan looked at him seriously. Questions like what? Questions like who you really are and why someone with your level of training is going through basic recruit exercises with the rest of us. Morgan was quiet for a long moment before responding. Sometimes people end up where they need to be, even if it's not where they plan to go. Is that your grandfather's wisdom too? Brandon asked. No, Morgan said quietly. That one's mine. Behind them, the 6 Marines who had been utterly outmaneuvered were having their own intense discussion about the small recruit who had just given them a master class in advanced combat operations. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the base's instructor network, and by morning, Morgan Reed's reputation would reach levels that would attract attention from far beyond the training facility. The morning after the hostage rescue exercise brought changes to Fort Bragg. Alpha Team emerged from their barracks to find the regular training schedule had been suspended. Instead, Sergeant Ramirez informed them they would be spending the day on specialized weapons training, a reward for their unprecedented performance. As the team headed toward the firing range, Morgan felt eyes on her back. She turned to find Colonel Thompson watching from the administration building, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood 2 men in civilian attire, dark suits that practically screamed government agency. Morgan's heartbeat quickened, though her face revealed nothing. Her grandfather had warned her this day might come. Everything okay? Carlos asked, noticing her momentary pause. Fine, Morgan replied, continuing toward the range. The weapons training proceeded normally until mid-afternoon, when Ramirez approached Morgan between drills. Reed, Colonel Thompson wants to see you in his office, now. The rest of Alpha Team exchanged glances as Morgan set down her rifle and followed Ramirez. As she walked away, Morgan heard Jason telling the others, I'm going to find out what this is about. Morgan felt a surprising warmth at his protectiveness. 2 weeks ago, he had seen her as an unwelcome intrusion. Now he was ready to defend her without knowing why she needed defending. Thompson's office was spartanly furnished. A desk, 3 chairs, and walls decorated only with maps and a few framed commendations. The colonel sat behind his desk, flanked by Ramirez. On the desk lay a worn folder with a faded classified stamp across its cover. Sit down, Reed, Thompson said, gesturing to the empty chair. Morgan took her seat back straight, hands resting on her knees, the position of readiness her grandfather had drilled into her since childhood. Your performance yesterday was exceptional, Thompson began. The Marines who participated in that exercise have collectively served in over 20 combat deployments. Not one of them has ever been outmaneuvered so completely. Morgan remained silent, waiting. Thompson tapped the folder on his desk. This came to my attention this morning. Project Nightshade, a CIA special training program from the Cold War era. His eyes narrowed slightly. A program I was personally involved with before it was shut down in 1990. A beat of silence filled the room. The techniques you displayed yesterday, shadow infiltration, predictive movement patterns, nerve center neutralization, these were signature methodologies developed for Nightshade operatives. Techniques that were never documented in any training manual, only passed directly from instructor to operative. Morgan's face remained carefully neutral, but her mind raced. Her grandfather had warned her about this too, that some of his techniques were unique enough to serve as fingerprints for those who knew what to look for. Who are you really, Reed? Thompson asked directly. Morgan took a measured breath. I told you the truth. My grandfather raised and trained me. And who was your grandfather? Ramirez pressed. Morgan hesitated, weighing her options. Her grandfather's first rule, never reveal more than necessary. But his second rule when cornered, give them something true but incomplete. A very private man who believed in being prepared, she answered. Thompson leaned forward. That's not going to cut it, Reed. Not anymore. He opened the folder and withdrew a black and white photograph. He placed it on the desk, turned so Morgan could see it. The image showed a group of men in military fatigues standing in front of what appeared to be a training facility. They were young, mid-20s most of them, with the hard eyes of men who had seen combat. Eighth from the left, Thompson said. Look familiar. Morgan's eyes found the figure. Tall, lean, with the same controlled posture she had inherited. Younger than she had ever known him, but unmistakable. Her grandfather. His name was Alexander Sullivan, Thompson continued. One of the most naturally gifted operatives ever to come through the program. He vanished after Nightshade was terminated. Official story was that he'd been reassigned to deep cover operations. Unofficial story was that he'd gone off-grid entirely. Morgan looked up from the photograph, meeting Thompson's gaze directly. And if that man was my grandfather, then you've been trained by one of the most dangerous men ever produced by American intelligence, Ramirez said bluntly. A man who apparently decided to pass on skills that were supposed to die with the Cold War. Thompson studied her face. The question is why? And why are you here using those skills in a standard military training program instead of in whatever shadow war Sullivan was preparing you for? Morgan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her next words would determine the path forward, not just for herself, but potentially for others. Her grandfather had never explicitly forbidden her from acknowledging his past if discovered, but he had made it clear that such revelation would have consequences. My grandfather believed in service, she said finally. He taught me that my abilities came with responsibilities. When he died 3 years ago, I had to decide how to honor that lesson. So you enlisted, Thompson nodded. But why not apply directly for special operations with your skills? Because I wanted to serve normally first, Morgan interrupted. To understand the military as it is, not just as he described it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Without waiting for a response, the door opened to reveal a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of authority. Behind him stood 2 younger men in similar attire, the same men Morgan had spotted earlier. Colonel Thompson, the newcomer said, I'm afraid I need to interrupt this conversation. Thompson stood immediately, his face registering surprise and something else. Wariness. Deputy Director Morrison, he acknowledged. I wasn't aware you were visiting Fort Bragg today. A matter came to our attention that required immediate attention, Morrison replied, his eyes finding Morgan. Ms. Reed, I'm Richard Morrison, Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Morgan rose to her feet, maintaining the composure her grandfather had instilled in her. Inside, however, her mind was racing. The DIA was several levels above a training base commander in the intelligence hierarchy. These are Special Agents Kim and Bradley, Morrison continued, indicating the men behind him. I believe you have information pertinent to an ongoing national security matter. Thompson's expression darkened. Deputy Director, with all due respect, this recruit is under my command, and if there's an intelligence concern, this isn't a request, Colonel, Morrison cut in smoothly. Ms. Reed will accompany us to a secure debriefing facility. Morgan felt the situation slipping beyond her control. Exactly the scenario her grandfather had warned might come. Before she could speak, the door burst open again. Jason Miller stood in the doorway, Brandon and the rest of Alpha Team visible behind him. Sir, Jason addressed Thompson directly, ignoring the newcomers entirely. We're here to report that our teammate is required for the continuation of our training and exercise. The audacity of the interruption left everyone momentarily speechless. Morrison recovered first, his professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal annoyance. This is a restricted meeting, soldier. Return to your duties immediately. Jason held his ground. With respect, sir, our orders are to complete today's training as a unit, all 6 members. Morgan felt something unexpected. A surge of emotion at the sight of her teammates standing together, inserting themselves into a situation they couldn't possibly understand simply because one of their own might need help. Morrison looked from Jason to the rest of Alpha Team, then back to Morgan. His expression changed subtly, calculation replacing annoyance. Perhaps we can accommodate both requirements, he said finally. Colonel Thompson, I'd like to borrow your team for a special exercise, all of them. Thompson frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction events were taking, but equally aware of the chain of command. What kind of exercise? A verification of yesterday's impressive performance, Morrison replied, under more realistic conditions. The words sent a chill through Morgan. Her grandfather had described intelligence community verifications, real-world operations disguised as training exercises with real stakes and often real danger. Deputy Director, she said, speaking for the first time since Morrison's arrival. My teammates aren't involved in whatever you think I am. Morrison turned to her with renewed interest. On the contrary, Ms. Reed, if you are who we believe you are, then your teammates are exactly what we need right now. He addressed the whole room. 3 hours, Special Operations Training Facility 6, full combat gear. His eyes lingered on Morgan. We have much to discuss about your grandfather, Ms. Reed, and about why his former colleagues are turning up dead. With that bombshell delivered, Morrison and his agents departed, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. What the hell was that about? Jason demanded once they were gone. Morgan looked at Colonel Thompson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Permission to speak freely. My grandfather was Alexander Sullivan, she told her teammates. He was part of a CIA Special Operations program during the Cold War. Apparently that connection has attracted high-level attention. Why, Ryan asked? Morgan shook her head. I don't know. But that wasn't entirely true. Her grandfather had prepared her for this possibility. His final instructions delivered on his deathbed echoed in her mind. If they ever come for you, remember, trust no one completely, not even those who seem to be on your side. As Alpha Team left Thompson's office to prepare for whatever awaited them at Facility 6, Morgan felt the weight of secrets pressing down upon her. For the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in seeking to serve openly. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training grounds. Jason fell into step beside her. Whatever's going on, he said quietly, we've got your back. Morgan looked at him, then at the rest of Alpha Team walking with them. These men who had first doubted her, then respected her, and now stood ready to follow her into an unknown situation simply because she was one of them. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. As they walked toward the barracks to prepare, Brandon spoke up from behind them. If your grandfather was Alexander Sullivan, he said carefully, then the rumors about him were true. Morgan glanced back. What rumors? That he was the prototype, Brandon replied. The original ghost. The operative they modeled an entire generation of special forces after. He paused. And that he disappeared because he learned something they wanted kept secret. The words hung in the air between them, carrying ominous weight as Alpha Team prepared to face whatever test awaited them. A test Morgan increasingly suspected had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the legacy her grandfather had left behind. 3 hours later, Morgan stood with Alpha Team outside the perimeter fence of Training Facility 6, a remote section of Fort Bragg used for the most realistic combat simulations. The facility consisted of a mock urban environment built to replicate conditions in various conflict zones. Deputy Director Morrison waited for them by the entrance, accompanied by his agents and several military personnel Morgan didn't recognize. Their expressions were grave, their postures tense. Alpha Team, Morrison greeted them. Thank you for your prompt arrival. What I'm about to tell you is classified. He gestured toward the facility. This isn't a training exercise. 3 hours ago, we received intelligence that a high-value asset is being held somewhere in this complex. The asset has critical information regarding national security. Jason exchanged glances with Morgan. This wasn't standard procedure even for specialized training. With respect, sir, Michael spoke up. We're still recruits. Why not use actual special forces for this? Morrison's eyes never left Morgan's face as he answered. Because they specifically requested Ms. Reed. Who requested me? Morgan asked, her voice level despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. The message was delivered via a dead drop method last used by Nightshade operatives in 1985, Morrison replied. It read, send Alexander Sullivan's granddaughter alone. She's the only one he'll trust. Morgan felt the blood drain from her face. He's alive. For the first time, Morrison's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine confusion. You believed your grandfather was dead. 3 years ago, Morgan confirmed. Heart attack. Morrison exchanged glances with his agents. Ms. Reed, we have reason to believe Alexander Sullivan is the asset being held in that facility, and that he specifically asked for you. The revelation hit Morgan like a physical blow. Her grandfather, alive. The implications were staggering, the questions overwhelming. But one thing was certain, if he had broken his cover to reach out, the situation was dire indeed. I'll go, she said immediately. Not alone, Jason countered, stepping forward. We're a team. Morrison studied them, both calculation evident in his eyes. The message specified alone. However, he added before Jason could protest further, a support team on standby might be prudent. What exactly are we walking into? Brandon asked, his sniper's instincts for danger clearly triggered. Unknown hostiles, Morrison admitted. possibly foreign intelligence assets, possibly domestic threats. All we know for certain is that Sullivan contacted us using emergency protocols that haven't been active for decades, and he specifically asked for his granddaughter. Morgan looked at her teammates, then back at Morrison. I need 5 minutes with my team. Morrison nodded. 5 minutes. Then we need your decision. As he walked away, Alpha Team huddled together, tension radiating between them. This is insane, Ryan said quietly. They're asking recruits to run a real operation. Not recruits, Morgan corrected. They're asking me. And you're actually considering it? Carlos asked incredulously. Morgan met each of their gazes in turn. My grandfather dedicated his life to this country. If he's alive and in trouble, I have to help him. Even if it means walking into a trap, Michael pointed out. Especially then, Morgan replied. Jason studied her face. You're going in regardless of what we say, aren't you? Morgan nodded once her decision made. Then we need a plan, Jason said, surprising her. Because there's no way you're going in without backup. For the next few minutes, they huddled together, formulating a strategy based on the limited information available. When Morrison returned, Morgan stepped forward. I'll go in alone, she stated, but my team will provide perimeter security and extraction support if needed. Morrison considered this, then nodded. Acceptable. We'll provide communications equipment and weapons. He paused, then added with unexpected sincerity, Ms. Reed, if your grandfather is indeed alive, there will be many questions that need answering. But first, we need to bring him home safely. As Morgan prepared for the mission, checking her equipment, with the methodical precision her grandfather had taught her, she felt a strange calm descend. 3 years of believing him dead, 3 years of carrying his legacy alone, and now possibly a reunion. But not under circumstances either of them would have chosen. Jason approached her as she made her final preparations. You know this could be a setup, right? Using your grandfather to draw you in. Morgan nodded. It crossed my mind. And you're still going? She checked her tactical vest one last time before answering. My grandfather's first lesson, always consider that every situation is a trap. His second lesson, sometimes you have to spring the trap to find out who set it. Jason shook his head with grudging admiration. Your grandfather sounds like one hell of a teacher. He was, Morgan replied, then corrected herself. He is. As darkness fell over Fort Bragg, Morgan stood at the entry point to Facility 6. Her teammates positioned strategically around the perimeter according to their hastily formulated plan. Morrison and his agents monitored from a command post nearby, their expressions tense with anticipation. Communications check, Michael's voice came through her earpiece. 5 by 5, Morgan confirmed softly. Remember, Jason's voice followed. Any sign of trouble you give the signal, and we're coming in. Morrison's orders be damned. Morgan smiled slightly at the protective tone in his voice. Understood. With a final deep breath, she stepped through the entry point and into the shadowy complex beyond, moving silently as only someone trained from childhood could move. Whatever waited inside, trap or truth, she would face it as her grandfather had taught her. With every step, one thought echoed in her mind: Alexander Sullivan was alive, and he had called for her. Night embraced Morgan Reed, or Shreed, as she moved through Training Facility 6, her footsteps silent on the concrete. The mock urban environment, designed to simulate everything from Middle Eastern villages to Eastern European industrial complexes, stood empty and ominous under the silver glow of a quarter moon. Years of training kept her senses sharp, cataloging every shadow, every potential threat point, every avenue of escape. If her grandfather truly waited somewhere in this labyrinth, he would have left signs only she would recognize. The communication device in her ear crackled softly. Perimeter secure, came Jason's voice tight with tension. No movement detected. Acknowledged. Morgan whispered, her voice barely audible, maintaining radio silence unless emergency. She switched off her transmitter, but kept the receiver active, another lesson from her grandfather. Always listen, seldom speak. The facility consisted of 3 main structures connected by alleyways and small courtyards. Morgan approached the central building first, noting the deliberate absence of security measures. Too easy, either a trap or an invitation. Near the main entrance, a small mark caught her attention: 3 vertical scratches on a door frame, seemingly random to any casual observer. To Morgan, it was as clear as a neon sign, the old recognition code her grandfather had taught her when she was just 7 years old. 3 marks vertical, proceed with caution. 4 marks, imminent danger. 2 marks, horizontal, safe passage. Morgan traced her fingers over the scratches. Recent made with something sharp and metallic. Her heart rate quickened despite her training. Proof of life. She entered the building through a side window, rather than the marked door, another of her grandfather's rules. Never use the obvious entry point, even when invited. Inside, darkness enveloped her. She moved by touch and memory, her eyes slowly adjusting to the minimal light filtering through dust-covered windows. The building had been constructed to resemble an Eastern European government facility, complete with Cyrillic lettering on the walls, an echo of the Cold War her grandfather had fought in. On the second floor, Morgan found another marker, a small chalk X on a doorframe. She paused, listening intently. Nothing but the soft whisper of air through vacant hallways. The room beyond was empty except for a metal desk bolted to the floor and a single chair. On the desk sat an old-fashioned tape recorder, the kind intelligence agencies had used decades ago, before digital technology had revolutionized espionage. Morgan approached slowly, scanning for tripwires or pressure plates, the kinds of traps her grandfather had taught her to both set and detect. Finding none, she pressed the play button. A voice emerged from the speaker, aged but unmistakable. Her grandfather. "Morgan, if you're hearing this, then my message reached the right people. I don't have much time, so listen carefully." The sound of his voice, a voice she had believed silenced forever 3 years ago, sent a shock through Morgan's carefully maintained composure. "My death was necessary. There are people hunting nightshade operatives, people with access to classified files and government resources. I've been tracking them for years. Now they're closing in." A pause filled with the soft hiss of magnetic tape. "The third floor, East Wing, room 314. Use the Sullivan Protocol. Trust no one except those willing to risk everything for you. I'm sorry for the deception, Little Shadow. It was the only way to keep you safe." The tape clicked off. Little Shadow. His name for her during training exercises when she learned to move unseen through the forest surrounding their mountain cabin. The confirmation she needed, this was genuinely her grandfather, not some impersonation to lure her in. Morgan ejected the tape and pocketed it. Evidence. Then she keyed her transmitter once more. "Alpha Team status report. Perimeter still clear," Jason replied immediately. "Morrison's people are getting antsy, asking for updates. Tell them I'm proceeding to the target location. Any sign of other players in the area?" "Negative." Brandon's voice cut in the sniper's tone, precise and controlled. "But something feels off. Military personnel shouldn't be this nervous for a training and exercise." Morgan considered this. "Stay alert. I'm moving to the East Wing." She navigated through the building's maze-like corridors, her mind racing through possibilities. If her grandfather had faked his death to escape pursuers, who were they? And why would they target retired Cold War operatives after all these years? Room 314 was unremarkable, another office set up with desks and filing cabinets. Nothing to distinguish it from a dozen similar rooms Morgan had already passed. But her grandfather had specified this location. The Sullivan Protocol, a search methodology he'd created teaching Morgan how to find hidden compartments and concealed messages. Start with the light fixtures, then door frames, then floorboards. Look for patterns in seemingly random arrangements. The filing cabinet yielded results first. The third drawer contained folders with random Cyrillic labels, except they weren't random at all. The first letter of each label, when arranged properly, spelled out a sequence of numbers, GPS coordinates. As Morgan copied them down, a sound from the hallway froze her in place, the soft scuff of a boot on concrete. Someone approaching, attempting stealth, but lacking the skill to achieve it completely. Morgan slid into position behind the door, weapon ready, but not raised. The footsteps paused outside, then the door swung open slowly. Carlos Diaz stepped into the room, his weapon held at the ready position. "Jesus," he breathed when he spotted Morgan. "Don't shoot. Jason sent me as backup." Morgan lowered her weapon slightly but didn't holster it. "Protocol violation. I was to proceed alone." Carlos nodded, his normally jovial face serious. Things changed. Morrison received new intelligence. Said the situation was escalating. He stepped further into the room. "Did you find anything?" Morgan studied him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the room. Carlos was normally the most relaxed member of Alpha Team, quick with jokes even in tense situations. This nervous energy felt wrong. "Nothing yet," she lied smoothly. "Still searching." "We should hurry," Carlos urged. "Morrison's ordering a full tactical team deployment in 15 minutes if we don't report progress." Another warning flag. The Carlos she knew would have made a joke about government impatience, not parroted official talking points. "Give me 5 more minutes," Morgan replied, moving to the window as if to check sightlines. "Then we can head back together." "No time," Carlos said, his voice hardening slightly. "We need to move now." Morgan turned slowly, the pieces falling into place. Strange, I never told Jason which building I was entering, let alone which room. Carlos's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. And the real Carlos would know that Morrison couldn't order a tactical deployment on a military base without going through the base commander first. Morgan raised her weapon. Who are you? The man who looked like Carlos smiled a cold expression, nothing like her teammate's warm grin. Smart girl, just like your grandfather. His accent had changed a slight Eastern European inflection, now detectable beneath the American English. His posture changed too, the casual stance of Carlos Diaz replaced by something more formal and disciplined. Where is my real teammate? Morgan demanded. Perfectly safe, the imposter replied. For now, as is the rest of your team, provided you cooperate. What do you want? The same thing everyone wants from an Alexander Sullivan protege information. He gestured to her pocket where she'd placed the tape. Starting with whatever he told you. Morgan's mind raced through scenarios. If this man knew about her grandfather knew about Nightshade, he represented exactly the threat her grandfather had warned about. And if he was here impersonating Carlos, it meant Alpha Team was compromised. Morrison sent you, she realized aloud. He's not D. The false Carlos shrugged. Morrison is exactly who he claims to be. Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, but his real loyalties are more complex. Nightshade was disbanded decades ago, Morgan said, buying time as she assessed her options. What could possibly be worth hunting down retired operatives now? Project Kingfisher, the man replied. Your grandfather's true legacy. The operation that never made it into any official record, not even the classified ones. He took a step forward. He didn't tell you, did he? His favorite pupil, and he kept you in the dark about the most important work of his life. Morgan maintained her aim, mind working furiously. Kingfisher. The code word from her grandfather's tape. She'd assumed it was simply a protocol name, but if it was an actual classified operation, let's make this simple, the imposter continued. You give me the coordinates Sullivan provided, and your friends walk away unharmed. Resist, and they start disappearing, beginning with the real Carlos Diaz. Morgan's finger tensed on the trigger. She could take him down right now, but doing so would eliminate her best lead to her teammate's location. How do I know they're still alive? She demanded. The fake Carlos removed a phone from his pocket, tapped the screen, and held it up. The display showed a security camera feed of Alpha Team, all 5 members secured to chairs in what appeared to be a basement room. They were alive, apparently uninjured, but heavily restrained. Satisfied, he asked. Now the coordinates. Morgan made her decision. Her grandfather had trained her for exactly this scenario, the impossible choice between mission and companions. His voice echoed in her memory. When forced to choose, pick the option that keeps you in the game longest. You can't help anyone if you're taken off the board early. 40.71 to 80 north, 74 Tau 60D west, she said clearly. The man smiled triumphantly. New York City, Manhattan specifically. Now we're getting somewhere. He pocketed his phone. What else did the old man tell you? Morgan lowered her weapon slightly as if capitulating. He mentioned Kingfisher. Said it was the reason they're hunting Nightshade operatives. And he said the evidence was hidden in plain sight. Something about the banks of the Hudson where the forgotten patriot sleeps. The imposter's eyes lit with recognition. Grant's tomb. He nodded to himself. Of course. Sullivan always did have a flair for the historical. He raised his weapon, training it steadily on Morgan. You're coming with us. Your grandfather values you above all else. You're our insurance policy. Morgan allowed a flicker of fear to cross her face, just enough to seem genuine without overplaying it. What happens to my team? They stay as leverage until we recover the Kingfisher files. After that, their memories of this incident will become conveniently clouded. His smile turned cold. A move, lowly. Any attempt to alert anyone in your friend's situation becomes considerably more painful. Morgan complied, moving toward the door with measured steps, her weapon now lowered. As they reached the threshold, she deliberately stumbled, dropping to one knee. The imposter maintained his aim. Clumsy, up, now. Morgan rose, hands visible. But as she straightened her foot, connected with the doorframe, 3 quick taps, a pattern that would be meaningless to most observers. Outside the building, positioned at his observation point, with a high-powered scope, Brandon Hayes caught the signal. 3-tap hostage situation, hostile escort. The sniper protocol Morgan had taught him during their training sessions. Brandon keyed his radio. Compromise. Reed is under hostile control. Implementation of contingency echo. Across the facility perimeter, the remaining members of Alpha Team received the alert. Jason, positioned near the main entrance, felt his heart rate spike but kept his outward demeanor calm. Contingency Echo, the fallback plan they'd created for worst-case scenarios. Inside, Morgan was marched at gunpoint toward a service exit, the imposter Carlos, maintaining a professional distance close enough to react if she tried anything far enough that she couldn't easily disarm him. "Your grandfather should have stayed buried," he commented as they walked. 2 years of perfect silence, then suddenly he reaches out. "Why now? What changed?" Morgan kept her response measured. Maybe he discovered who was hunting his former colleagues. He always knew who. The question was why. The imposter checked corners as they moved, his training evident in every motion. Kingfisher should have remained in the past where it belonged. They reached a service door leading to an alley between buildings. The imposter pressed a communicator in his ear. "Package secure, moving to extraction point Alpha." As the door opened, Morgan prepared herself. Contingency Echo would be triggered the moment they exited the building, a coordinated response that depended on perfect timing and absolute trust between teammates. The night air hit them as they stepped outside. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The world exploded into action. A flashbang grenade detonated at the far end of the alley, bright enough to be disorienting but positioned to avoid blinding Morgan, who had closed her eyes at the exact moment of detonation. The imposter instinctively turned toward the threat, his weapon shifting away from Morgan for a critical half-second. It was enough. Morgan dropped and pivoted, sweeping her leg against his ankles while simultaneously reaching for his weapon arm. The move, practiced thousands of times in mountain clearings under her grandfather's watchful eye, was executed with precision born from endless repetition. The imposter was good, his reaction nearly fast enough to counter. Nearly. Morgan's hand closed around his wrist, twisting with calculated pressure against the radial nerve. The pain response was involuntary, his fingers loosening just enough for her to strip the weapon from his grasp. He recovered quickly, driving an elbow toward her temple that would have ended the fight had it connected. Morgan slipped underneath, using his momentum against him, as she maneuvered behind him, applying a blood choke that cut off circulation to his brain. "Where's my team?" she demanded, maintaining the hold with precise pressure enough to threaten unconsciousness without delivering it. "You're outnumbered," the man gasped, still struggling. "Morrison has a dozen operatives on site." "Wrong answer." Morgan adjusted her hold, increasing pressure until the imposter went limp in her arms. She eased him to the ground, securing his hands with his own belt before taking his communications device. "Brandon's status?" she whispered into her own communicator. "2 hostiles neutralized near the north perimeter," came the sniper's calm reply. "Morrison and 3 others are at the command post, unaware of the situation." "Ryan Michael," no response. "Jason Carlos," silence. Morgan checked the phone she'd taken from the imposter, pulling up the security feed. The basement room was still visible, her teammates still restrained, but now 2 armed men stood guard over them, weapons ready. "Brandon, I need a location on the rest of the team." The imposter had a video feed. "Working on it," Brandon replied. "Based on the architectural features visible in the background, they're in the sub-level of Building 3. Morgan moved quickly, staying in shadows as she made her way toward Building 3, using the imposter's communication device. She listened to the chatter between Morrison's operatives, most of it coded, but enough clear text to piece together their deployment pattern. 12 hostiles total, 4 with Morrison at the command post, 2 neutralized by Brandon, 1 unconscious at her feet. 5 remaining, including the 2 guarding her teammates. The odds were improving. Morgan reached Building 3 and found the access point to the sublevel, a maintenance door with a keypad lock. She examined the imposter's phone again, searching for clues to the access code. Nothing obvious, but the phone itself might be recognized by any biometric security measures. The keypad, however, showed signs of repeated use, slight wear patterns on certain numbers. Another lesson from her grandfather observation reveals patterns most people never notice. The most worn keys were 196 and 4, a 4-digit code using those numbers. Most likely a year. 1964, too early for this facility. 1994, possible. 1996, even more likely given the facility's construction timeline. Morgan tried 1996, the light remained red. She tried 94, nothing. Final attempt before the system would likely lock down 1964. The light turned green. The year Nightshade was established according to her grandfather's stories. These people were definitely connected to the old program. The door opened to reveal a narrow stairwell leading down. Morgan moved silently and weapon-ready senses alert for any sign of hostiles. At the bottom, another door, this one with a small window allowing her to see into the hallway beyond. Clear. She slipped through, moving toward the location where her teammates were being held. The sub-level was utilitarian concrete walls, exposed pipes, minimal lighting, designed to simulate Eastern European bunker systems for training exercises. Voices ahead, two men speaking in low tones, the guards. Morrison wants the girl alive, one was saying. The others are expendable if necessary. Seems like a lot of trouble for some ancient Cold War files, the second replied. Those files are worth billions to the right buyers. Names of deep cover assets, blackmail material on half the political establishment from the Soviet era, insurance policies that never expired. Morgan processed this information as she evaluated her options. Two guards, both armed, between her and her teammates. Direct confrontation risked casualties. Stealth approach would take too long, and Morrison would eventually realize something was wrong. She needed a distraction. Using the imposter's phone, she composed a text message to the contact labeled Command, Intruder Alert North Perimeter. All units respond. After sending it, she waited, counting seconds. The guards' communications devices buzzed simultaneously. They looked at each other in confusion. North Perimeter, one questioned. That's where Stevens and Rodriguez were stationed. You stay with the prisoners, the other decided. I'll check it out. Perfect. One down. As the first guard exited through a door at the far end of the hall, Morgan prepared to deal with the remaining obstacle. She removed a small capsule from her tactical vest, one of the special items her grandfather had insisted she always carry. Breaking it open, she released a small amount of powdered substance near the ventilation intake that fed into the holding room. Within 30 seconds, the remaining guard was coughing violently, his eyes watering. He stumbled out of the room, seeking fresh air, and walked directly into Morgan's ambush. One precise strike to the vagus nerve, and he collapsed unconscious. Morgan entered the holding room to find her teammates exactly as shown in the video feed, secured to chairs, alert but restrained. Took you long enough, Jason commented, relief evident beneath his bravado. Sorry to keep you waiting, Morgan replied, moving quickly to cut their restraints. Status report. They grabbed us one by one from our positions, Michael explained as Morgan freed him. Professional operation, military precision. These aren't ordinary government agents. They're hunting my grandfather, Morgan said, moving to release Ryan next, in something called Project Kingfisher. Your grandfather's alive, Carlos asked incredulously, rubbing his wrist as Morgan cut through his bonds. I thought, so did I, Morgan interrupted. It's complicated. We need to move. Morrison has at least 7 operatives still active, and they'll realize something's wrong any minute. What's the play? Jason asked, immediately shifting to tactical planning. Morgan considered their options. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and in hostile territory. Standard protocol would be to retreat, regroup, and reassess. But, Brandon prompted, recognizing the tone in her voice. But my grandfather's still out there being hunted by the same people who took you. Morgan checked the ammunition in her weapon. And I need answers. So we take the fight to them, Jason concluded. Morgan nodded. Morrison's the key. He's coordinating this operation. We capture him, we get leverage and information. 5 against 7, Ryan calculated, plus Morrison, not great odds. I've had worse, Morgan replied with a grim smile. Besides, they're not expecting us to go on offense. They think they have all the advantages. What's the plan? Michael asked, always focused on tactical details. Morgan outlined her strategy quickly, a multi-pronged approach designed to isolate Morrison from his security detail and force a confrontation on their terms. Each member of Alpha Team would play to their strengths, Brandon providing overwatch, Carlos creating diversions, Ryan and Michael executing flanking maneuvers, while Morgan and Jason confronted Morrison directly. As they prepared to move out, Jason caught Morgan's arm. Your grandfather, he said quietly. If he's alive, why stay hidden for 3 years? Why let you think he was dead? Morgan had been asking herself the same question since hearing the tape. Protection, I think. As long as everyone believed he was dead, I wasn't a target. She checked her weapon one final time. But something changed. Something made the risk of contact worth the danger it would bring. Kingfisher, Jason surmised. Whatever it is, Morgan agreed. Let's find out. The team moved through the facility like shadows communicating through hand signals, in the silent language of soldiers who had trained together intensively. They neutralized 2 more of Morrison's operatives through careful coordination and the element of surprise. Meanwhile, Brandon set up a sniper position with sightlines to the command post, where Morrison and his remaining security detail had established their base of operations in a prefabricated structure near the facility's main entrance. 3 targets visible, Brandon reported over the secure channel. Morrison and 2 security personnel. The third is likely nearby but not in view. Positions, Morgan queried. Morrison is seated at a command console. Guards standing 1 at each entrance. Standard protective formation. Morgan signaled to Carlos, who grinned before disappearing around a corner. 30 seconds later, an explosion rocked the far side of the facility, not large enough to cause significant damage, but certainly sufficient to demand attention. Movement, Brandon reported. Both guards alert. Morrison ordering one to investigate. As one guard departed, Jason and Morgan approached the command post from the blind side, moving in perfect sync. Michael and Ryan established blocking positions to prevent reinforcements from returning too quickly. One guard remaining. Brandon updated. Standing directly behind Morrison now. Clear shot on neither. Morgan nodded to Jason, who produced a small object from his tactical vest. A flashbang grenade modified for reduced concussive force, but maximum disorientation effect. 3, Jason counted down softly. 2, 1. The door crashed open as the grenade detonated inside the command post. Morgan and Jason moved in immediately, Morgan targeting the security guard, while Jason focused on Morrison. Despite the disorientation from the grenade, the guard managed to draw his weapon only to find Morgan already inside his defense perimeter, her movements too fast for his impaired senses to track. 3 strikes in rapid succession, solar plexus, throat, temple. The guard collapsed without firing a shot. Jason, meanwhile, secured Morrison, who had attempted to reach for what appeared to be a panic button on the command console. Deputy Director Morgan greeted him coolly, weapon trained on his center mass. I believe we need to revisit our earlier conversation, starting with who you really are and what you want with my grandfather. Morrison's professional demeanor had cracked, revealing a cold fury beneath. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Reed. This is far beyond you and your little team. Kingfisher, Morgan stated flatly. An unauthorized operation run during the final years of the Cold War. Something worth killing for, apparently. A flicker of surprise crossed Morrison's face before he controlled it. Who told you that name? My grandfather, Morgan replied. The man you've been hunting, the man who's still very much alive despite your best efforts. Morrison laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Alexander Sullivan, the ghost who wouldn't die. Do you even know what he did? What Kingfisher really was? Why don't you enlighten me? Morgan suggested, her weapon never wavering. It wasn't just an operation, Morrison said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. It was insurance. Your grandfather and his team buried evidence, mountains of it, documenting decades of off-the-books operations conducted by elements within American intelligence agencies. Operations that, if exposed, would bring down governments and reshape global alliances. Blackmail material, Jason summarized from his position. Strategic leverage, Morrison corrected. Insurance against betrayal by the very agencies they served. Sullivan and his team knew the rules of the game. Once an asset becomes a liability, they're removed. Kingfisher was their protection against being discarded. Morgan processed this information, comparing it against everything her grandfather had ever told her about his service. He had never mentioned Kingfisher specifically, but there had been hints, oblique references to contingency plans and protection protocols. And now you want that leverage for yourself, she concluded. Morrison's expression hardened. Those files belonged to the agencies they were taken from. Sullivan and his team were thieves stealing government property for personal insurance. Men who spent decades in the shadows sacrificing everything for their country wanted some guarantee they wouldn't be eliminated when they were no longer useful, Morgan countered. Seems reasonable to me. Regardless of your opinion, Morrison said, those files contain sensitive information that could damage national security. They need to be recovered and contained. By killing everyone who knows about them, Morgan challenged. How many former Nightshade operatives have you eliminated already? A commotion outside interrupted their confrontation. Gunfire erupted, followed by shouting. Through her earpiece, Morgan heard Brandon's urgent voice. Multiple hostiles approaching from the north perimeter. Military-grade weapons and tactics, not Morrison's team. Jason exchanged a glance with Morgan. Reinforcements. Morrison's expression registered genuine confusion and concern. Not mine. The command post door burst open as Michael rushed in. We've got serious problems. At least a dozen armed operatives breaching the facility perimeter. Professional hit team by the looks of it. Before anyone could respond, the communication system on Morrison's console crackled to life. A voice spoke, male, elderly, but strong with command presence. Morgan, if you can hear this, you need to move, now. The people coming are not here to talk. Morgan's heart nearly stopped. Grandfather, yes, Morrison's communication channels are compromised. You're all in danger. There's an emergency exit tunnel in Building 2 sublevel access point. Charlie, get there. 15 minutes. The transmission cut off. Morrison stared at the console, then at Morgan. That's impossible. We've been monitoring all communications channels. Evidently not all of them, Morgan replied, mind racing through the implications. Her grandfather was not only alive but nearby and monitoring the situation. And now unknown hostiles were converging on their position. Who are they? Jason demanded of Morrison. If I had to guess, Morrison replied, his professional demeanor reasserting itself, foreign intelligence assets. The kind of people who would pay billions for the Kingfisher files. The kind who don't leave witnesses. Morgan made a split-second decision. We're moving to the extraction point. All of us. She gestured to Morrison with her weapon. Including you, Deputy Director. Consider yourself in protective custody. You're making a mistake, Morrison warned. I'm not your enemy here. You had my team abducted and threatened their lives, Morgan reminded him coldly. Enemy is exactly what you are. As gunfire intensified, outside Alpha Team regrouped and moved toward Building 2, Morrison in tow as an unwilling companion. Brandon provided updates on the approaching hostiles, a professional strike team using coordinated movement patterns and communication discipline that spoke of high-level training. These aren't typical mercenaries, Brandon observed through his scope. These are special forces operators, maybe former Spetsnaz by their movement patterns. They reached Building 2 just as the first of the unknown hostiles entered the facility's main courtyard. Michael located the access point to the sublevel, and they descended into the darkness below. The sublevel was a maze of utility quarters and storage rooms. Carlos took point, navigating by the emergency lighting and following Morgan's directions based on her facility knowledge. Access point, Charlie should be at the end of this corridor. Carlos reported, checking a junction ahead. Clear so far. They moved forward, the sounds of conflict above growing more distant. Whatever force had arrived was engaging Morrison's remaining operatives, buying Alpha Team precious time. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy metal door marked with a faded C stencil. No electronic locks, just an old-fashioned mechanical system. This facility was built during the early Cold War, Morgan explained as she examined the door. Emergency escape tunnels were standard features in case of nuclear attack. How do you know that? Ryan asked. Morgan smiled slightly. My grandfather helped design some of these training facilities. He made sure I knew the layouts just in case. In case of what? Jason wondered aloud. In case of this, apparently, Morgan replied, manipulating the lock mechanism with practiced movements. The door swung open to reveal a narrow tunnel dimly lit by emergency lighting that flickered with age. The team entered cautiously, with Brandon taking up rear security to watch for pursuers. They had traveled perhaps 100 yards when Morgan felt a subtle change in the air pressure, the kind that preceded someone opening a door into a sealed environment. She signaled for the team to halt and take defensive positions. Ahead, a figure emerged from a side passage, tall, lean, with the rigid posture of military bearing, despite his obvious age. White hair cut short in military fashion, face weathered by time, but still handsome in its severity. Eyes that Morgan would have recognized anywhere, the same eyes she saw in the mirror every morning. Alexander Sullivan, very much alive, stood before them. Grandfather, Morgan whispered, 1,000 emotions warring for dominance in that single word. Sullivan's face softened almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to emotion Morgan had ever witnessed from him. You've grown, he said simply. His eyes moved past her to take in Alpha Team, lingering briefly on each face before settling on Morrison, who stood under Jason's guard. And you've brought company. They're my team, Morgan explained, and he's the man who's been hunting you. Sullivan nodded. Richard Morrison, we've never met in person, but I know your work. The elimination of 3 Nightshade operatives over the past year bears your signature, clean professional with excellent cover stories. Morrison's expression remained neutral. I was following orders, Sullivan, same as you always did. The difference, Sullivan replied, is that I knew when certain orders should be questioned. He turned his attention back to Morgan. We don't have much time. The people above are merely the first wave. There will be others. Who are they? Morgan asked. Former KGB, now working for private interests, Sullivan explained. One of many groups who would kill for the Kingfisher files. Which you hid, Morrison interjected. Sullivan's gaze hardened. Which we protected from people who would misuse them. People like you, Morrison. A distant explosion shook dust from the tunnel ceiling. The conflict above was intensifying. We need to move, Sullivan decided. There's a vehicle waiting at the tunnel exit. Enough discussion for now. Not good enough, Jason spoke up, surprising everyone. No offense, sir, but Morgan thought you were dead for 3 years. You show up now with mysterious files everyone's willing to kill for foreign hit teams on your tail, and you expect us to just follow you without explanation. Sullivan studied Jason with new interest. You must be Miller. Morgan's messages about you were accurate. He glanced at his granddaughter. You've chosen your teammates well. Messages, Morgan questioned. What messages? The postcards you sent from Fort Bragg, Sullivan replied. The ones with the invisible ink messages detailing your training progress and team dynamics. Morgan's confusion was evident. I never sent any postcards. Sullivan's expression shifted to one of alert concern. Then someone has been monitoring you and reporting on your activities. Someone who knows our old communication methods. Another explosion closer this time. Details later, Sullivan decided. For now, we need to extract. All of us. He looked directly at Morrison. Even you, Deputy Director, your usefulness as a source of information outweighs the inconvenience of your previous actions. They moved quickly through the remainder of the tunnel, merging into a wooded area half a mile from the training facility. As Sullivan had promised, transportation awaited a nondescript van with civilian plates. As they piled in, Morgan positioned herself next to her grandfather. There were 1,000 questions she wanted to ask, 1,000 emotions she needed to express. But years of his training had taught her to prioritize survival over sentiment. Where are we going? She asked instead. Sullivan started the engine. New York City, where Kingfisher began and where it will end. As they drove away from Fort Bragg, the night sky behind them glowed orange with the fires of conflict. Whatever game was being played had escalated beyond training exercises and intelligence operations. It had become a shadow war with Alpha Team now caught in the middle. Morgan looked at her teammates' men who had gone from skeptics to allies to something approaching family in just a few short weeks. They had followed her into danger without fully understanding the stakes. They had risked everything based on trust alone. Her grandfather had taught her many things over the years, combat techniques, survival skills, tactical thinking. But he had never taught her about trust, about the bonds formed between people who fought together. That was something she had learned at Fort Bragg. I'm sorry I got you all involved in this, she said to her team as the facility disappeared behind them. Jason shook his head. We're Alpha Team. Where one goes, we all go. Even into a decades-old conspiracy we know nothing about, Ryan asked with a half-smile. Especially then, Carlos confirmed his usual humor, returning despite the circumstances. Brandon nodded his agreement while Michael simply checked his weapon, his actions speaking his commitment. In the driver's seat, Alexander Sullivan observed the interaction with interest. His granddaughter had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The solitary fighter he had trained had found something he had long ago sacrificed for the mission, genuine human connection. As they drove toward New York and whatever confrontation awaited, Sullivan recognized that Morgan had perhaps learned the most important lesson of all. One he had failed to teach her because he had never truly understood it himself. True strength came not from isolation and self-reliance, but from the people who stood beside you when everything was on the line.